Welcome to the Contemporary Guitar Blog. I'm Trevor Babb, and I'm here today with Nicole Murphy. We're going to be talking about a piece of hers that she wrote all the way back in 2014 called Isa. And we're talking about it today because it's appearing on a new record that I have coming out of solo guitar music, written by composers for me and pieces that I've picked up along the way. And so, Nicole, thank you so much for joining me all the way from Australia. I think that you win the prize for being the guest on this show that has the most challenging time difference to coordinate with. So I'm glad that we can sit down and do this now. And thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So, this piece, Isa, for what was originally for two guitars, is a piece that Nicole wrote for me and Jordan Dodson, who's a great New York-based guitarist. It was part of this Norfolk new music workshop at the Norfolk Summer Music Festival that's hosted by Yale in Norfolk, Connecticut. And Nicole ended up coming all the way from Australia to be there. And you signed up for this project knowing that it was going to be a guitar centric festival workshop of writing for guitar. Was guitar an instrument that you had ever written for before?
No, absolutely not. I mean, it wasn't an intentional thing, but I had just never had a commission for guitar previously, and I must have somehow escaped it during my student days.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually signed up for the workshop. I mean, I knew there was guitar, a guitar focus, but I'd actually signed up because there were some faculty members that I was really, really excited to work with. So that was sort of my primary reason for signing up. And in particular, like Lisa Moore as a Australian US-based pianist, growing up as a young composer, she was on nearly every recording of kind of every composer's piano music that you'd be listening to. And so that was a major draw card, being able to work with Martin Bresnik. And then this sort of opportunity to write for guitar was completely fresh and completely terrifying, to be honest. So that was sort of my primary motivation. And initially I thought I was just writing for guitar in an ensemble sense of guitar plus some other instruments. And so I thought, oh, this is okay. I can do that. It's just part of this beautiful fabric, and might play some harmonics here and there and just contribute to this lovely sort of spacious sound world. And no one will know that I'm not 100% certain of what I'm doing in this, what can be, for a non-guitarist, a pretty terrifying instrument. And then, as it turns out, I had the opportunity to write this duo, and so I thought, all right, I better work my way around this, and sort of delved into the guitar world with a lot more serious, much more serious approach, I suppose.
So talk about that a little bit. How did you prepare to write a piece for two guitars? What kind of score study did you do? Who did you kind of do some preliminary work with, or at all? To really prepare for writing for this instrument that really is, for people who don't play it, a very scary instrument to write for.
Yeah, I just listened really widely and did a lot of score study. I don't remember any specifics now, so many years on. I just remember, the stack of scores that I had taken from our university library to study. But what I spent a lot of time doing with those scores and when I was writing the piece, is just drawing fingering charts and plotting out, like, within particular passage work, what would one potential fingering be for that. And I play a string instrument, so I understand the concept of positions and so forth. It translates a little differently, but I figured for me, if particularly with any fast passage work, if I could find one way that it was playable, then I knew that the guitarist would find, 600 ways, because that was always the way. There's always, so many possible ways to play something. So that was sort of my approach, was just all these little drawings of the fretboard and working out, if I could find one way, then I thought, well, we'll be okay.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of some comment that somebody said about the Queen's Gambit when she sees the chessboard on the ceiling, how we guitarists just see the fretboard. And it seems like you were really kind of getting into that world. Um, anyway, So yeah, this is something that we talk about a lot with guitar, that it's, an asymmetrical instrument with a lot of alternate fingerings and a lot of different locations to produce the same pitch, which really does make it super challenging. And so talk a little bit about the process of writing Isa, and like um what sorts of things were you wrestling with the instrument?
Well, I mean, the wrestling, yeah, what was I wrestling with? I guess one of the main things to me is that I want the music to be, whatever instrument I'm writing for, I want it to be two things. I want it to be stylistically my voice and what I'm wanting to express and communicate, but I'm also wanting it to feel, idiomatic for the instrument. I want it to be, to fit well under the hand, to be something that celebrates the tradition of the instrument and what each instrument does well, rather than fighting against that. And obviously there are times where you do need to push things and fight against the instrument's natural tendencies, but just overall making sure that the instrument is sort of the forefront of that playability, the pleasure of playing it, is part of the music. And so that was sort of a starting point for some of the ideas in the piece of my perception, which may not be a guitarist's perception, of what would be enjoyable to play on the instrument. And then, of course, like the sound world that I wanted. So there's these two movements of one that's kind of more spacious and open, and then this fast rhythmic movement. The other thing that was really important was the dialogue between the two instruments, which is interesting because we're talking, now for this recording about the solo version. But that was something else that was very much at the forefront of my mind, was that interaction between two players and the intimacy of chamber music, which I suppose solo music has in a different way.
Yeah. Very, very, very interesting. And yeah, it is kind of interesting because it is a pretty, as the duo, it really is a dialogue kind of piece. And I've turned it into this like big monologue thing, which is just hilarious. But because we have those multiple locations for multiple pitches, the dialogue to some degree is still there. Even in the solo version, it just kind of manifests a little bit differently. Um, Talk about the title, Isa. Like what are we dealing with that word? I saw that word and I was like, what even is that? So talk a little bit about
What sort of
Isa. And
Australian English is this?
yeah, like I was like, oh, I don't know what these three letters mean, but they must mean something. So please tell us.
Sure. When I was writing the piece, I was working in a town called Mount Isa on a project. And Mount Isa is a regional town, outback Queensland. And it's a very, very interesting and distinct place. And I'd done a few projects there, and was sort of there for a large period of time, working not so much in the town itself, but in the remote communities around it, with students who are really isolated and don't have much access to arts education. So we'd sort of go out for weeks at a time and camp with a group of students for a week and create music together, and in these just amazingly remote locations that you'd never go to normally. They're well off the normal pathway. And Isa itself is a really fascinating town. So as you fly into it, you're just seeing this red earth, and there's a big mine there, unfortunately. So you see the smokestacks of the mine, which dominate the landscape. So whenever you're traveling back there by road, you're close to town because you start to see these smokestacks emerge out of the otherwise quite barren landscape. So you're flying in and you just see this, for hours of the flight around, you're just seeing empty land, or what looks like empty land, red dirt, and then the hot pink bougainvillea vines, because they're the only things that flower in that sort of landscape. So it's this very distinctive place, and it's a really interesting town. It's everyone who's there is either, just new in town and is moved there for work for a short period of time, or they did that 20 or 30 years ago and then they never left. But there's just this beautiful sense of community in the town, a real vibrancy of activity, and a real sense of resilience, because I guess they're so isolated, that they need to, rely on each other and sort of make their own fun. So that first movement is really celebrating the open landscapes and just this real, what feels like emptiness, in the landscape. And the second movement is really this very vibrant, active movement that sort of celebrates that sense of community and the activities. I mean, the amount of um, things that I did there outside of the work projects was far more than I would do in my everyday life in the city, because it's like as soon as you're off the clock, someone's got some activity that they want you to come to. There's just, this real sense of making your own fun. And it's just a completely wild place. So that's what the piece was written about. I was there, I think, the whole time I was writing this piece, and it just seemed like a natural thing to reflect on this very interesting place that I'd found myself.
Wow. So let's talk about workshopping the piece in Norfolk. How did, I mean, I know it was a long time ago. It feels like forever ago for me. Um, but let's talk a little bit about just how the piece developed there while workshopping it and rehearsing it. Um, what sorts of things surprised you when the piece got into like real human performing hands? What sorts of things happened that weren't expected? Anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like a lifetime ago. And I think there's this really interesting sort of phenomenon as a composer, is that the piece in its final form, after that collaborative process and after performing or recording a piece, in my mind, it's like that becomes the piece, and it's hard to remember where it started. And I probably should have just pulled out those early sketches, which, would have been filed away somewhere, and had a look to see. But one thing, I mean, the main thing that I remember from that workshopping period was just the idea of just this continual dialogue between yourself and Jordan of where to play things and what colors, these beautiful subtle changes in timbre depending on where on the instrument a passage was played. And so in that way, it was like the guitar was a whole orchestra. It just opened up all of these orchestration possibilities that hadn't factored into my initial thinking. I mean, they had in a broad sense, but there's very, very, it's like when you work with a percussionist and they give you 7 different pairs of mallets, and you've got the tiniest grain of difference between them, but it makes overall this huge difference to the work. And so that to me was the main kind of eye-opening thing of how different the work could be. The other thing I do remember, which you probably remember as well, is that the second movement had a crackingly fast tempo initially, and then once in the room with resonance and motion, it definitely did not need to go that fast, nor could it go that fast.
I think I told you, like, right when we arrived there, I was like, are you sure about that fast tempo in the second movement? Because I don't think I can play it.
I don't know anyone could. It's interesting I think this is quite common with fast music, is you mark that tempo up because you want that sense of vibrancy and motion and excitement, but it could be 20 points lower in terms of the tempo marking, and as long as the player is communicating that, it's fine. So I think from a compositional perspective, often I'm inclined to mark tempos faster when I want that feeling, and then realize in the rehearsal process, oh no, we can bring that back.
Yeah, it's so easy, I think, to like let the MIDI automatons just go and do it and everything sounds great, and then it gets into like human hands and it's like, oh, this is like really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I don't use MIDI, like I write by hand,
Yeah.
and
Oh, yeah,
publish
yeah,
on
yeah.
the computer. But one thing I notice is that, like, you don't imagine how much space the resonance takes up,
Mm-hmm.
when you're in the room, and also just physical activity gives a sense of vibrancy. There's that kind of space you need for the virtuosic motion. So you want the sound to be like a little bit further apart, the gestures, so that you've got the time for that motion to be part of the performance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, so let's fast forward a few years.
Sure.
Um, I'm putting this album project together, and really like what prompted me to like revisit this thing was I was looking at the pieces that I already had, and I was like, these are all dudes. And I realized like I'd never actually played a solo guitar piece by a woman. I had actually worked with women a ton with chamber music and, that kind of thing, and even electric guitar music, but solo classical guitar piece, I had nothing. And so I was like, this is kind of an issue. And it got me thinking, because when I first got your score in 2014, I actually started trying working it out on the instrument by myself, both parts at the same time, just to kind of figure out, like, okay, what's this going to sound like? And I recalled that and I was like, oh, could I make Nicole's piece a solo piece? So when I contacted you and said, hey, can I do this? Like, what was your initial reaction?
I mean, my reaction was, I don't think you can, but go for it. I just particularly, I mean, the first movement, I could see how that could happen. But the second movement, I just thought, I cannot imagine how this is going to work. But I'm very happy for you to give it a shot. I mean, if someone's got a chance of making it work, it's definitely more you than me. Just because of the way that I'd conceived the piece originally. So I was delighted when I first, you first played me sort of the solo version. I couldn't believe it.
I couldn't believe that I made it work. That second movement, I was like, this is going to be tough. But and like we did actually kind of like change some things in order to accommodate it for the like I'm someone who, if I'm like, I'm gonna try to do it to the letter as much as I can. And I remember playing for you, and it was like, well, let's take these notes out, and then this will just be a different kind of thing here, where there isn't so much like density, and it's more just like, let's focus on this fast, passage of 16th notes with maybe just a few bass notes, and like forget about harmony for a minute, because the harmony is outlined here in the figuration, and it'll give you a little bit more room so you're not freaking out. But so you've listened to both. Now you've listened to the duo version, you've listened to the solo version. How does what changes when it goes solo? What and what are the strengths of both?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. Like in my, I don't know, my old age as a composer, that I think, I think when you're younger, you imagine like the piece that you write is exactly set in stone and that's it. And, it's exactly crafted for those instruments and that circumstance. And you kind of can't see it any other way. And then, I don't know, just as you, I suppose, mature as a composer, you realize that as long as what you're communicating stays the same, as long as the intent is still there, you can change lots of tiny little things, and even entire passages, and the overall impact of the piece communicates the same thing. And so I think, I said that sense of dialogue in the original version was really important to me. But as you say, I think that is still there in the solo version. There's that different kind of intimacy in a solo performance, but that intimacy is still there. I think the character is still communicated in the solo version. And I think, obviously solo music is a much more performable, version. It's obviously solo guitar is easier to program than a guitar duo, just in the sense of you need one less person. So I think it's that's definitely one of the strengths of having the solo arrangement, is just from a practical perspective. And I think particularly in the last couple of years, that's become very apparent.
Hmm. Yeah, I think I remembered after having just practiced the solo version just so much. I actually during COVID, actually, I was leading a group class with some students, and it was like Suzuki guitar group class, right? And it was like, group class means we play together, right? And you can't do that over Zoom, right, when everybody's in their house. So I started kind of turning that into a repertoire class, and I was starting to run out of things to talk about at some point during COVID, because we were online for like 16 months. And I was like, oh, I could talk about Nicole's piece. And I've actually played both the duo and the solo version for the students. And what I was struck by especially was like how just on the brink the duo piece feels in such a good way, because there's this just tension between the two players. I remember us like really rehearsing all these arpeggiated chords and like let's land on our top notes together, and it just feels so like everything's just floating in midair. And the solo piece has a much like stronger sense of groundedness to it, because you don't I don't have to coordinate with anyone else other than my right hand and my left, and which sometimes is hard to do, but yeah, it really it just makes it very very different that there's kind of I think that this sense of like suspendedness in the duo kind of gets lost a little bit in the solo piece, at least as I recorded it. And that might be an interesting thing to think about, as the piece develops in my hands more, is just like, how do I get in touch with that sense of openness, especially in the first movement,
Mhm.
where because like you say, there's all this space there, and I think it's just so easy to like say, yep, that's what the rhythm says and I'm going to put that note there. And when you have the flexibility with someone else, things just kind of wobble a lot more in a good way.
Yeah,
um
I mean, that's fascinating. I'd not thought of it in that sense. And I think, yeah, you're right. There is that sense that you're responding to someone else. So it's just trying to maintain that in the solo version. And then I think the coordination of the fast movement in the duo version is obviously, a challenge and an exciting challenge
mhm,
performance wise, because it feels like it's, you've put your seatbelt on and you're sort of just holding on for dear life at times. But in the solo version, you retain that energy because you're trying to compress, these two fast moving lines into one. So it really has that sense to me of the vibrancy and the kind of edge of seatness that it should have.
yeah. um so I I know that you've done some writing for guitar since the workshop, because the other piece that you wrote at the workshop, because there was also this electric guitar and ensemble piece which I ended up playing later at a different festival, um that ballooned into something huge. But talk about writing for guitar since the workshop in 2014, including the expanded version of Stolen, which is
Sure.
an ensemble piece.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe this was my punishment for thinking that I could hide behind my lack of guitar knowledge initially by, just writing a few harmonics in the middle of an ensemble piece. But my delightful punishment was that this ensemble piece that I'd written, which wasn't supposed to be kind of guitar centered, just happened to have this sort of extended solo passage for guitar in the middle of it. That piece, Stolen, after the festival, the guitarist Solomon Silber asked me to expand it into an album length work for the same ensemble. And we came together the following summer to record and, collaborate and rehearse and record that piece. So that was a really interesting process from a compositional standpoint, because the piece that I'd written was based on a poem by Richard James Allen, a terrific Australian writer. And I'd actually mirrored the form of the poem in the form of the piece. And so when Sol asked me to expand the piece, he said, "Oh, I can imagine this as a central movement of this larger work." And I just couldn't kind of work out how to write around it, because it was in my mind. It was the essence of the piece was that it had the form of this poem, which has all of this energy and motion and movement up front, and then it kind of dissipates as that energy kind of dissipates as the piece progresses. And so I ended up breaking the original version of it apart and expanding each section into this larger work. So I suppose that original piece now exists as sort of the little universe of the larger 45-minute work. And there's actually quite a lot of versions of the piece. So the 45-minute version, one of the stipulations was that each of the musicians would have their own solo movement, which was such a joy to craft, because I had collaborated with this ensemble so closely at Norfolk. And then I could craft, each solo movement around their personalities and their strengths as performers. So they were a real joy to write. And I wanted those pieces to be gifts to them that they could perform as standalone works as well as part of this larger piece. So those solo instrument works get performed, very often outside of the huge set of 45 minutes of music. And then quite a few ensembles have commissioned various versions of that 45 minutes. So there's a couple of 12-minute versions that are sort of a stitching together of different movements floating around in the world. So it's, this very malleable kind of changing piece, all based on that universe of that 6 or 7 minutes that premiered at Norfolk and that, you've played as well.
Cool. Yeah. Anything else since then?
There's a little solo guitar piece that I actually wrote for Jordan Dodson, who
Oh,
premiered
right.
ISA
Yeah,
with
yeah,
you.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that might be it.
Wow. So, I mean, we're gonna have to put you to work again, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, so what else do you have going on in your musical life with, now that kind of maybe the world is starting to open back up a little bit more? Um, Talk a little bit about, recent projects and things going on in the musical world of Nicole Murphy.
Sure. I've been thankfully very busy during the last few years, which I know is a real luxury as a composer. We didn't get shut down necessarily. So I've been writing a lot of music. Hasn't all necessarily been premiered, unfortunately, but there is a backlog that is, just starting to make its way into the world as performances are being rescheduled. So sort of current projects, I've got a premiere of an orchestral piece, a 30-minute orchestral piece coming up in about a week's time here in Brisbane, but also able to be heard at the Australian Digital Concert Hall, which is a terrific initiative that sprang forth during COVID to broadcast music to people when we couldn't go to live performances.
Mhm.
And it's great that still exists for accessibility. I've got a big theatre collaboration with Real and Diverse Theatre, which is sort of a theatre choreography based piece. So that's a big chunk of 45 minutes of music responding to the artists in that company, which has been a really great collaboration. That's also a local project here in Brisbane. Stateside, my chamber opera, The Kamikaze Mind, will happen in Chicago in July by being put on by Thompson Street Opera. And I've got a piano trio at the Lunart Festival in Madison, Wisconsin, next month in June. And then a portrait album, hopefully coming out at the end of this year or early next year. As you know, these things take so long to get together. This was initially a 2020 project, unfortunately involving musicians from 4 states in Australia. And then, of course, we had all of our state borders closed for a long time. So getting people together has been obviously a real challenge. So now that things are open up again internally here, we can get that underway, hopefully with no further delays. So a portrait album towards the end of the year.
Yeah, I know that the final edits for this project were scheduled to be on like March 12th of 2020, which is basically the week that everything went crazy. And so, and it ended up being about 365 days later that we actually sat down via Zoom with a separate audio stream and got these edits done because it was just like survival mode until then. So I know about this whole things just take longer than they should. We're still nailing down a release date, but it should be out very soon this year. Well, very, very cool. So thank you so much for sitting and talking about your music. We're really looking forward to getting this thing out. And hopefully, we'll be working together again soon. So thanks so much for coming on the show and talking with me, Nicole.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.